Welcome to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, the podcast 10 for 10, which brings you the week's top 10 compliance stories curated together in one podcast each week. Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, brings you the compliance professional stories you need to be aware of at the end of your busy week. Sit back and in 10 minutes, hear about the stories every compliance professional should be aware of. Every Saturday, 10 for 10 highlights the most important news, insights, and analysis for the compliance professional, all curated by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. Get your weekly filling of compliance stories with 10 for 10. Hosted by Tom Fox. 10 for 10 is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Also, if you are looking for something new and different for the upcoming Compliance Week celebration in November, check out The Compliance Kids. It's my 3-book children's series on compliance and compliance professionals for children. But they make great gifts and great training tools for your employees. You can check it out on Amazon.com. We've linked to it in the show notes. First, a word from the sponsor of the Compliance Podcast Network for this month, Ethico.
If you're a compliance officer, middle managers are crucial in getting your programs from you to your frontline employees. But how do we activate those managers and get them on our side? Ethico's new Middle Manager Toolkit equips you with the skills needed to empower your managers, to promote a culture where ethical behavior thrives and employees feel empowered to speak up. Learn how to turn frontline managers into ethical leaders with our new white paper, Empowering Middle Managers as Ethics Champions. And did I mention you can get the whole toolkit for free? Head to ethico.com to download the full toolkit today.
10 for 10 for the week ending November 16, 2024. Our first story comes to us from Bloomberg, which reports that ADM, Archer Daniels Midland's chief compliance officer, will depart from the company in early 2025, for personal reasons, perhaps to pursue other opportunities or perhaps not. But it is in the middle of a huge foobar around accounting issues at the firm, with the ADM saying in a regulatory filing it was delaying the release of a financial statement for Q3, and it may have to restate previous reports. This follows last week's disclosure ADM had found errors in accounting, and it was cooperating with the SEC in a probe over these mistakes. We continue a story that at least touches on the SEC, and a story from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Richard Vandeford reporting that, no surprise to anyone who's been alive the last 2 weeks, Gary Gensler's ambitious SEC agenda is not in danger. It is over. With the Trump election, obviously Gensler will resign. If he doesn't resign, he'll be fired. And his push for climate disclosure rules, cryptocurrency enforcement, focus on ESG will all simply end under the leadership of whoever Trump chooses. Now, some of the people he has floated for the head of the SEC are well known within the SEC community and could consider mainstream, although his appointment of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General puts really everything wide open. Next up, from the first of two stories from the New York Times, Meta was fined $840 million in Europe for anti-competitive behavior. You find them for breaking competition laws with its Facebook marketplace, its shopping platform, and classified ad platforms. The latest actions by regulators to limit the ability of tech giants to expand. Meta says that it will appeal this, but once again showing that the EU is certainly being a thorn in the side of big tech in a way that regulators in the United States certainly are not. Our second story from the New York Times comes to us from Stanley Reed reporting from London that Shell has won its appeal of a landmark Dutch climate case where a lower court had ordered the company to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. Shell had argued that a single firm should not be hit with an arbitrary pollution reduction requirements, and the Court of Appeals in the Netherlands agreed. Of course, this will have to go to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, but this is a huge victory for Shell. And finally, Gary Wang, former SBF adjunct and chief executive of FTX, is cooperating with with regulators to help build software to help the U.S. government uncover fraud in the stock market and the crypto market. If successful, this will certainly be a big boon for the data-driven analytics enforcement that was portended by the hiring of Matt Galvan by the Department of Justice a couple of years ago. So Mr. Wang is actively cooperating and actually working on this software. So we expect to see more from these initiatives by the Department of Justice and other regulators to help detect fraud in the market from public-facing data. Next up, from GamesIndustry.biz website reports that NetEase employees have been reportedly detained on money laundering and bribery charges amounting to an estimated $139 million. As reported by Bloomberg, 2 senior executives were among those allegedly arrested in China. The alleged corruption occurred within the esport and distribution marketing sectors. An unknown number of individuals linked to the anti-corruption charges are also under investigation. I was incorrect. We have a third article from the New York Times, and it's about managing a challenging employee where health issues are affecting a worker's performance. So how do you help an employee who is conscientious, competent, and seasoned, yet with chronic health conditions will impact her or their disability, I should say. So some of these are pretty complicated questions, but it all involves a conversation with the employee and working with the guidelines of the American for Disabilities Act. From HomelandSecurity.com, or actually HomelandSecurityToday.us, an article on the high cost and hidden cost of noncompliance in the apparel and textile industry, how supply chains are being impacted by customs and border protection regulations and crackdowns. It's no longer just a formality because with the enforcement of withhold release orders, the CPB can detain goods if there's a suspicion the materials in the supply chain involve forced labor or otherwise violate trade regulations. Obviously, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is probably on top of mind of most people, but other acts may come into play as well. We had an FCPA enforcement action involving Telefónica Venezuela, paying $85 million to resolve bribery and corruption in that company and then that country. And our final story comes to us from El Pay, which is an article about science and what it reveals about our tendency for corruptions. It was most interesting because it focused on what leads to corruption, and it turns out it's not so much the bribe payor, it's the bribe receiver. And that means if you live in a country which is prone to corruption, or at least has a high incidence of corruption, and or you're in a high-risk business model, you need to pay extra attention to that with greater risk management. I found this really interesting because it dovetails with almost precisely what the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission have been talking to us about literally for the past 15 years in FCPA enforcement actions. Assess your risks. If it's high risk, put in a high risk management strategy. 10 for 10 is a special production of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, our network sponsor is Ethico, and they've got a great new service offering for you, a middle manager's toolkit. We've linked to it in the show notes, and it's available to you at no cost. Many companies struggle with getting information to middle managers, which allows them to be the first line of response in a speak-up culture. And Ethisphere has answered this challenge by putting together a middle manager's toolkit. Check it out in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of 10 for 10. I hope you'll check out the newest podcast in the Compliance Podcast Network, the Compliance Tip of the Day. In Compliance Tip of the Day, I give a 5 to 8 minute summary of one tip that you can integrate into your compliance program or put together for greater compliance program efficiency.